Welcome back to part 2. I'm your guide, Shamini Dias. In the first part, we did a quick overview of semiotics, the subjective and phenomenological storying nature of semiosis, that the world stories us and shapes in turn how we story the world. In this part, we'll explore the danger of stories, especially when there is a single story, and as a response to that, how we can find multiple stories through mapping and counter-mapping. What happens when someone only has a single story? Author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie speaks about the danger of the single story. In the resource packet that you have in the reference list, I've put a link to her TED Talk, and I really encourage you to have a listen. She is a great storyteller. But I love this quote from her talk. "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign. But stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people. But stories can also repair that broken dignity. When we reject the single story, when we realize there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise." Adichie's story, The Danger of a Single Story, is important in thinking about the semiotics of how we sense make in approaching our work. We often do not realize just how actively we seek patterns, and especially what blind spots we have to implicit patterns we embody and to the patterns of others. Which stories have more power and impact? As Adichie explains, the power dynamics in the world determine what stories are loudest and most prevalent. Do our stories oppress? Are we oppressed by stories others tell? There is also a sharp danger of clinging to a single story out of fear and a refusal to engage with the new and unknown. So, I thought this would be fun. How does storying as semiosis locate itself within the Knöfin framework? Now, I'd love to have you pause the video, think about this a little bit before I share my story with you. Maybe you will have different stories that we can juxtapose and explore together. So, here is my story about stories. Single stories abound in clear and complicated spaces. In the former, single stories live as unexamined patterns of thought and response. We have clear categories, stories, into which we neatly fit things. What does not fit has no signifying value. In complicated space, single stories are paradigms of power. The single story is meta-narrative. Organizational, social, national, and global meta-narratives organize human interaction, but also create signals of conflict and exclusion. Sometimes hegemonic imposition marginalizes and erases other stories. One question then that comes up is a transdisciplinary or transparadigmatic question. Can we intentionally and actively seek out multiple stories about each other and the world around us as an antidote to the numbing effect of the single story? Transdisciplinary work in sustainability research, for example, attempts to do this. The danger of the single story speaks to the importance of the unordered spaces for current times, and especially the complex space of liminality and multiple potentialities for emergence. Artists and innovative thinkers know this well. They have always brought counter stories, new stories, though they have often been rejected or even vilified for this. I'm thinking of Galileo, Copernicus, Van Gogh, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi. The single story of socio-racial hegemony is currently being questioned all around the world, being dismantled and pushed into these unordered spaces of transformation and emergence that allows new stories and hence new social realities to emerge. And does a kind of semiotic crisis happen, I wonder, when dominant stories disintegrate or clash? Do power dynamics often determine our first responses in a crisis? So now let's turn to another kind of semiosis in storytelling, maps and mapping. This poem lays out the solidity and certainty of maps, cartography, laying flat the truth of the world. But then it turns to question, wait, whose map? Whose story? What is a story from the perspective of others? What is not there? Why is it not there? What happens if we put it there? So maps, how we make sense of land masses, our planet. They seem to be objective signs. Here we have the long-standing Mercator map of the world, but we could ask those questions here. Whose story is this? About what lands, prominence, and global focus? What does it leave out? With mapping, then, we have counter-mapping. The concept of counter-mapping comes from radical geography, ethnocartography, and public participatory mapping. The quote from Hartley speaks to the social power of maps as a single story, the danger of what they leave out. For Nancy Peluso, who is credited with the term countermapping, creating alternative maps with local populations was a way of starting a critical dialogue with planning authorities. Peluso worked with local populations in Kalimantan on negotiating land and resource use. She found that state maps that determine resource allocation and development had no connection to the way local people living on the land mapped their spaces. Their semiotic mapping, the granular view they had of signs salient to them on the land, were very different to the semiosis involved in creating the standard topographical maps that determined where roads could be built. I see this as a semiological process of representing a system of signs that are significant in the stories we tell about the significant signs of our experience in the world. And I think it also reminds us that there are multiple counter maps that hopefully can prevent a singular view and allow conversations to begin. I thought I'd share some actual counter maps in cartography here that challenge dominant narratives of how we make sense of the planet. The maps at the bottom with south at the top, these two, they foreground the normalizing of only one way of seeing. North is up, by disrupting that perspective, flipping it on its head. Isn't it interesting how we say things like, oh, then things went south when things go wrong? Why is north up with all the metaphorical connotations of that word up? This, the orthograph map by Hajime Narukawa, was created to intentionally pull focus away from east-west, north-south relations that were dominant through the 19th and 20th centuries, and especially our focus on land as our living environment. Instead, it calls attention to current global issues connected to the impact on oceans and the polar regions, which in turn, of course, affects human life on lands. And I love this quote by Alan Carroll. He's program manager for storytelling at GIS Research Institute, ESRI, and previously he was chief cartographer at National Geographic. He describes himself as a believer in the power of maps to tell stories. Maps themselves are stories. They are simplifications, distillations, and interpretations of a hugely complex world. Maps provide meaning and context. They reveal patterns and relationships. When we see these three quotes together now, we see the danger of the single story that Adichie spoke about. Each map or story we make is just one semiotic arrangement. Are we aware of what is there and what is not? Is it because it is absent or invisible to us, or because it has been intentionally left out? This raises questions for us about the ethics of sense-making in human interaction and decision-making, and maybe the glimmerings of a method or process to seek and integrate multiple counter-maps or stories in any work we do to arrive at an ethical exploration of stories, powerful narratives, and counter-hegemonic thinking. I've added some links to this set of slides that you can explore from the slide set. They're also copied into the final list of references, and I thought you might enjoy, especially these mapping websites. You get to try playing with your own counter maps. Thank you for your attention to part 2, and I will see you in part 3.